She stood on the line of frost like a blade left in the dark. Mira Voss, throat working as if the names of her past could choke her, the moonless sky making her a shadow no one could ignore. Her fur was burned silver by the cold and by the strange light that lived in her bones now. Her eyes caught the torchlight and threw it back like knives. Beside her, the rogues she had forged into a pack watched the gates of Northwood as if the whole ridge might split open and vomit fire. Alaric Voss stepped out of the archway with the slow, practiced calm of a wolf who has eaten kings. His silhouette filled the gate, broad-shouldered and immovable, and when he spoke, his voice carried like the tolling of a bell over a frozen valley. "You were a mercy I could no longer afford," he said. The words were an old knife, honed by repetition and meant to stay sharp. "Leave, Mira. Go back to whatever savagery has made you dangerous." Mira's laugh surprised everyone, a short animal sound that shattered into something else. "You called it mercy," she said, and the syllable struck the line of betas and elders like a summons. "You called abandoning your smallest daughter mercy while you kept your alliances intact. Mercy is when you tell the truth, Alaric. Mercy is when you face what you did. Wait before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Torches flared along the palisade and voices rose, some in fierce loyalty, some in stifled uncertainty. Mira's coalition, those who had wandered into rogue lands and chosen her, remained a single shifting mass behind her. A veteran beta with a missing ear who still wore his old pack marks as defiance. A young Omega who had been spat out from 2 packs and now carried a confidence like a weapon. A scarred healer whose hands still shook when she closed them on blood. They looked to Mira not because of blood, but because she had given them names and a place. Her shoulders did not tremble. The wound in her chest had long since become a compass. Alaric's stare landed on her as if measuring a threat. "You bring rogues to my border and call it justice," he said. "You bring chaos where order has stood for centuries." "I bring the truth," she answered. "I bring a question that cannot be left in the dark. Why was I left where the moonless wolves hunt? Who signed the papers that called me a liability?" There was a hush, a dangerous breath between night and frost. Within the assembled crowd, Rowan Hale pressed his palms into his coat to still the tremors of a human heart that had started beating faster the moment he had heard her name. He had followed rumors for months, murmurs in taverns, scraps in legal filings, a photograph that showed a small girl with eyes too old for her face being carried from the forest edge. A chronicler of secrets, Rowan had been drawn to lichen politics the way moths came to flame, impossible and inevitable. He had never believed he'd be at the center of one. "Rowan Hale," Alaric said, seeing the human at the edge of the press with a cold sort of incredulity. "Curious how the journalists come when things get interesting." Rowan straightened. He had come in the cloak of a liaison permitted by old treaties, an intermediary between human courts and lichen alliances, but he was not a shield. He had a notebook in his coat, a camera tucked where no alpha might find it, and a stubbornness that had cost him friends and, once, he feared, might cost him everything else. "I came for truth," he said simply, "and possibly because I could not look away." Alaric's lip curled, and a murmur rippled across the pack like water. "Truth is a luxury for those who do not have to guard a border," he said. "You forget, chronicler. Your kind and mine are better kept in separate pens." Mira's laugh this time had less edge, more the bitterness of someone who had swallowed names for years and now found them lodged like stones. You separated me, yes, she said. But pens don't hold everything, Alaric. Sometimes what you lock out comes back armed with names. The first act of ceremonial defiance had been planned. Mira would stand at the boundary and demand an answer. She had come to Northwood not with knives hidden in her sleeves, but with witnesses. Rogues who had built a new order in the cracks left by alphas who thought strength only came from muscle and decree. They had come because they had nowhere left to be afraid. Mira had given them something stronger than fear: purpose. And purpose can unnerve even those who think themselves the world. The Northwood elders had been called in, betas who had ruled in Alaric's shadow, old wolves who had been with him since his rise. They watched with eyes that weighed the past heavier than possible futures. A younger beta, Callan, shifted his jaw visibly, his loyalties layered with the sort of hesitation Mira had seen before in wolves who had once chosen caution over courage. She noted these things mechanically, while inside she catalogued memories of loneliness. A child's hand left to clutch nothing but cold ground. Nights of phantom hunger. The mouths of other wolves that called her a thing to be hidden. Rowan was close enough to smell her, rosewood and iron, and a scent that tasted faintly of dust and rain. He observed like a man who had learned to read faces the way others read law. The tightness at the corner of a lip, the way a hand flattened when lies approached, the micro-expressions that betrayed more than 1,000 proofs. He had watched her as she walked across the field, watched how her pack opened for her, not like sheep, but like wolves acknowledging a leader worth following. His notebook tugged at his control. He wanted to ask her everything and nothing at once. "You will be answered," Alaric said, his voice softer for a moment, the way razor steel can be polished. "The pack deserves order. I am the Alpha. I protect Northwood." "You protect a lie, then," Mira said. "You protect the facade of order while you bury inconvenient blood." Alaric's pupils thinned like knives. The word inconvenient landed like a contemptuous stone. "Do not use that tone with me, Mira," he warned. "You do not know the balances we hold." "Then explain them," she challenged. "Explain what balance justifies handing a child to rogues in the night and calling it mercy." The crowd shifted. The night tightened like a held breath. For Rowan, the moment was the kind of journalism dreams were made of: a public confrontation, a challenge to power, the possibility of revelations that could rewrite charters and alliances. But under that professional thrill was a personal tug, an intuitive sense that this fight was not simply political. It was intimate. It was about the way men and wolves wounded those they loved in the names of what they believed they were protecting. Alaric stepped closer, a predator used to closing distances. He smelled like old smoke and pine sap, like long winters and older grudges. "You know nothing of the treaties," he said. "You nothing, human, of these obligations." Rowan's jaw set. "Then tell me," he said. "Tell me in public. I will record it. People should know why you let a child go." There it was, the first crack. There was a change in the air, the kind that meant decisions made in private would have to find new shape in the light. Alaric's face, for a heartbeat, betrayed the man behind the mask. The tiredness at the edges, the hard place where regret had tried to lodge. He looked at the gathered wolves, the betas whose sons he'd placed as spokes in the wheel of his empire, the elders whose allegiance was as much to a stable roof as to a leader. He seemed to weigh not only his pride, but the practicals of ruin. Before he could answer, a voice rose from the other side of the boundary, a messenger from a neighboring pack, one whose leather crested with the sigil of the Ashen Crossing. He had come in the role of envoy, but when he opened his mouth, he did not speak of treaties. "We were told," the envoy said, metals faint in his tone, "that Northwood keeps its people pure." Murmurs shot through the crowd like foxfire. Alaric's expression closed like a trap. Purity. Such words always smelled of old fears and blood. Mira heard the way it hit the assembled rogues. She saw how the young Omega's jaw clenched because he'd been called less than so many times he had stopped being surprised. She felt the familiar burn in her chest that memory could conjure so perfectly. Rowan swallowed, feeling suddenly like an outsider who had stepped onto a stage already rigged with old weights. He glanced at Mira, at how she took the word purity and breathed on it until the edges blurred into something human and personal. She had been cast out for being weak, but the suggestion of impurity, half-human blood, was a different, uglier accusation. It made sense in a way that made Rowan's stomach turn. Treaties, alliances, the brittle equilibrium of alphas who needed certainties. If her blood was a scandal, then the act of abandoning her was not mercy, but a calculated erasure. Mira's question hung in the air like a bell. Alaric had a history of decisions that made Northwood strong, or at least unchallengeable. He had built a regime of fear and control that kept pack borders clean and political marriages tidy. He had punished dissent with an economy of cruelty that was efficient because it was believed necessary. Yet here, at the lip of his territory, someone returned, demanding an accounting, and the balance of his carefully ordered world trembled. As the torches hissed and the cold seeped into the bones of the assembled, Rowan realized he had a choice: to remain a chronicler on the periphery, or to step into a narrative that might unmake much of what he thought he knew. Mira, standing like a woman who had been remade out of exile, looked at Alaric not as father, but as architect of her past. The valley between them pulsed with histories that never had the courtesy to be simple. The question that would set the rest of the night, perhaps the rest of the story, was not simply who had left whom at the edge of rogue territory. It was who had declared that some blood could be erased for the sake of order, and whether a pack could hold such violence without cracking. Alaric opened his mouth again, the slow sound of a man about to recite a doctrine. Mira's small smile was almost tender. "Tell them your treaties, then," she said. "Tell them why I had to be hidden. Or tell me. I'll take the truth from the mouths of those who remember." A beta to Alaric's left shifted, as if the old loyalties were beginning to rattle like loose metal. Rowan read it as one reads a weather map, signs and treacheries. He also felt, for the first time, the dangerous, intimate knowledge that he was not immune to what Mira stirred in him. The ache of wanting to keep someone safe from a past that had not deserved them. The stirring of a tenderness that made him reckless in ways words could betray. Night deepened, torches burned brand. The first act had closed with a dilemma that tasted like iron and hope both. Mira demanded the truth, Alaric had the power to deny it, and Rowan, who had come for a story, found himself willing to risk complicity to uncover it. The border would not be breached easily. Northwood's gates had long been the teeth of a machine made to keep things out. But something else prowled tonight, the idea that what was cast out could return, not as beggar, but as storm. The first torch sputtered, as if insulted by the cold. Then the night swallowed the sound, and everything returned to a raw and luminous focus. Mira, Alaric, and the lines between them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Alaric's jaw flexed, and he took a single, measured step back, an old alpha conceding distance because he could not yet give ground. And the packed silence of the valley broke. "Very well," Alaric said, authority worn like armor. "If you demand answers, we will arrange them. But know this, public hearings are not playgrounds for sentiment." His eyes swept the rogues with contempt that glittered like frost. If any of you intend to incite my people, you will face law." Mira's lips thinned. "Then bring your law into the open. Call your elders. Let the truth be measured without shadows." A murmur of relief, like air released from a bellows, passed through her coalition. The veteran Beta with the missing ear dipped his head, a small, almost ritual acceptance. And Callan, the younger Beta from Alaric's ranks, flicked his gaze between father and exile with something like curiosity and something like fear. Rowan felt the atmosphere shift. The chance for public adjudication would force Alaric either to reveal his hand or to further hide behind the old lies. Both outcomes would tilt more than this night. "Tomorrow," Alaric declared, "we will convene on neutral ground. I will answer in full. Until then, leave your disturbances at the gates." Mira's look was two opposing waves, triumph and warning. "I don't plan on leaving this valley until the truth is spoken," she said, "and I won't let you call what I am a disturbance." Rowan realized then that whatever courage had driven her here was not theatrical. She intended to hold her ground. The rogues around her stood like a living rampart, not with teeth bared, but with a steady, constant presence that made the cold seem secondary to its purpose. Rowan, human and chronicle-suited, felt underdressed to the truth that hummed around him. He'd expected to keep distances, to record and retreat. Instead, something in him, a part that had always prized honesty above caution, tightened in agreement with Mira's defiance. Night passed with a brittle, watchful demand. Fires kept low, sentries on both sides moving with the caution of creatures keyed to ancestral skirmishes. Rowan sat by a small, shielded flame with her rogues, the folded posture of a leader who'd learned to sleep while standing. Rowan drifted close enough to be in the orbit of her silence, close enough to see the tremor in her hands when they braided a strip of leather. "You shouldn't sit so exposed," he said, because he had the kind of habit of speaking truth that had once cost him relationships, and then, oddly, given him a few more. "Northwood's lookouts will notice patterns. Alphas keep little lists." Mira's eyes lifted, and for a second he saw the child she had once been, a fragile shape beneath a merciless sky. And then she vanished into the woman formed by her exile. "What would you have me do, chronicler?" she asked. "Hide? Crawl back into the wood like a secret shame? I have stood too long in the open to dream of shadows." Rowan felt a tug at his throat that had nothing to do with cold. "Neither should you have to stand alone," he said. It was not flattery, it was a truth that came out of care. He stopped himself. He had promised to be a chronicler, not a savior, and yet words were a kind of armor, and sometimes they slipped into places they were not meant to go. Mira's mouth softened in something like gratitude and irritation at once. "You sound like you want to draft me into a story, Rowan Hale. Be careful. Wolves and chroniclers both break things when they try to shape them." "I'm only saying." He swallowed the rest, because the rest would have been finer and more reckless. That he would stand with her, that he would shield what she needed shielded. Instead, he offered her a small, practical thing. "When the hearing convenes, demand witness statements, names, dates, paper. Alphas like Alaric live in ink as much as they do in muscle. If it's political, you'll find signatures." Her laugh was almost private, so small it could have been mistaken for wind. "I intend to collect what my enemies would throw away as trash," she said, "but I appreciate your faith in ink." They fell into a cautious, companionable silence. Around them, the rogues tended fires and weapons, the community functioning in ways that echoed pack life but refused to replicate Northwood's iron structures. There were lovers guiding each other's hands through winter, a small child brushing a scarred healer's cheek with the promise of unashamed affection. These moments were small revolutions, proof that an outcast world could foster tenderness, even while the drum of the coming hearing beat in their bones. Morning arrived with a thin, brittle light. Word moved like smoke. Alaric had agreed to a hearing in the old threshing ground between Northwood and the river where neither side could claim full ownership. Elders would attend, scribes would be present. For the rogues, it was an extraordinary invitation, one they accepted like emissaries stepping into a court that had always excluded them. For Alaric, it was dangerous. For Mira, it was a chance to show that exile had not hollowed her, but had sharpened her. They walked to the meeting ground like a procession of some new religion. Rowan found himself between lines of wolves and rogues, notebook ready, hands a little less steady than he liked. The threshing ground crackled with the kind of tension that made old wood creak. It was as though history itself had taken a seat and would be asked to witness. Alaric arrived with his retinue, a column of polished wolves whose loyalty had been rendered into trimmed fur and precise postures. He carried with him not only the weight of his title, but also the hush of meaning behind his treaties, the thing that had allowed him to cast away a child without shattering the alliances that kept his pack safe. He stepped forward, and for one fevered second, Rowan saw, under the stern lines, a man who knew how to perform power for the sake of greater peace. It was a performance he had been taught and honed. He was a leader who understood that appearances guarded bargains. "Start," Alaric commanded, voice tuned for the crowd. Mira walked to the center without hesitation. "I will begin with one question," she said, the words precise and cold as breath. "Who signed the papers that declared me a liability and arranged my removal from Northwood?" A murmur like rainwater in a gutter. Alaric's eyes did something peculiar. He flicked everywhere but at her. A human move, Rowan thought. To deny eye contact is to avoid being read. "It is in the archives," Alaric said. "The matter was handled as a security concern." "Then let your security documents be called," Mira said. "Let your elders read them aloud if they are so necessary. Let every signature be known." The hearing began as a controlled thing. Betas reciting the official line, elders nodding in agreement with rituals of deference. But Mira had prepared herself with a hunger the chronicler recognized as crucial to truth-seeking. She called witnesses, rogues who had found her the night she had been left, a merchant who remembered a carriage at the edge of the wood, a healer whose hands had tended a child's fever, a child with eyes like a Voss. One by one, the testimony built a picture that made the hair on Rowan's arms lift. It was methodical, not melodramatic, a construction of proof rather than a blaze of accusation. Alaric's men countered with authority and control. "We operate on intelligence," his spokesman intoned. "Children left at borders risk whole packs. We cannot maintain stability if we permit weakness to spread." It sounded like doctrine, because it was doctrine. Words designed to wring empathy and leave it dry. Callan, the younger beta who had been watching with the conflicted expression of someone who'd been taught obedience over doubt, rose, swaying as if pulled by something heavier than him. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then met Mira's eyes. For a suspended second, loyalty and conscience warred like wolves. He spoke, and his voice surprised the field by breaking on first syllable. "There were notes," he said. "I saw files encoded. I thought they'd been destroyed. I thought it was for the pack." The admission was small but seismic. Alaric's face tightened into the kind of controlled rage that is most dangerous because it is rehearsed. He shot a glare at Callan that had the power to make the younger beta seem suddenly smaller than his title. But Callan's statement had been a wedge driven between old practices and truth. Whispers started like loose threads tugging at upholstery. Rowan felt the moment like an approaching storm. The air charged, leadership challenged, a father's secret at risk of splintering the myth of unassailable strength. Mira watched Callan as if she were seeing what she had always known, that the machinery of power required human hands, and sometimes those hands faltered. Rowan, listening with both a chronicler's hunger and a nascent lover's protection, felt both exhilaration and a rising fear. Truth had a cost, and it would have to be paid. Alaric, for the first time, allowed himself the barest flicker of emotion. Regret or calculation, Rowan could not tell. He composed himself and offered an alternative, a private adjudication before a select tribunal. For the sake of the realm, he said smoothly, we will examine the documents in closed session. Public declarations can destabilize things. Mira's retort was immediate, stinging with the righteous anger of someone who had been silenced. You would hide your choices behind secrecy again? Is that the mercy you offer? If this was truly done for stability, the pack deserves to know why. If you keep it sealed, then you confirm that what you feared was scandal, not safety. Alaric's face hardened like ice pushed to the point of fracture. You would risk alliances, he said. And you would risk a daughter's truth, Mira said. The valley held that phrase like a prayer. Smoke of outrage threaded through both packs. Rowan watched the lines of loyalty ripple, some faces tightening with fear for the pack's safety, others loosening in disgust at the thought of being kept ignorant. Bonds that had once seemed immovable revealed the human frailty behind them. Every small gesture, a frown, a licked lip, a tightened grip on a weapon, announced internal calculus. Mira had not only forced the question into the open, she had made openness a weapon against the old order. Alaric, sensing the balance tilt, offered a last-minute compromise that smelled of a tactic, an on-site inspection of archives under his direct supervision, with witnesses chosen from both sides. The meeting would be delayed by 2 days. The crowd dispersed with the nervous energy of people who had been promised something that could either incandesce or reassure. Rowan walked with Mira as they left the threshing ground, the landscape between them a lattice of frost and pine. He could see how the events had left her both energized and raw, like a cut that smarted that had been cleaned. She kept her walking steady, but when she thought she was out of sight, she let out a breath that sounded like grief and victory folded together. You may have moved more than you know, Rowan said. He was trying to be useful, not intrusive. You forced a fissure. People will watch. Mira's smile of him was tiny and complicated. And you? You will walk away when the pages are read? She asked. Rowan's chest tightened in a way that had suddenly nothing to do with the cold. I don't walk away from things I begin, he said. It was meant to be professional, but it landed in the space between them like something else, an unvoiced promise. The 2 days before the inspection held an orchestration of small tensions. Alaric convened closed consultations with his most trusted betas, the ones whose loyalty ran like iron through them. And in their shadows, he made subtle, cold offers, favors to other alphas, renegotiations of borders, a quiet exchange of political currency designed to keep the peace in case his name was stained. Mira's rogues trained, gathered evidence, and coaxed reluctant witnesses into bravery. Rowan moved like an invisible current, taking notes, asking quiet questions, keeping his recorder close, but also offering Mira shelter when her nights were rough with dreams. Late one dusk, as snow began to feather down like hushed verdicts, Rowan found Mira alone at the river edge, stripping a bandage from a forearm scar. You did not have to do the political work alone, he said softly. There are things I can help with. Documents can be forced to speak. Mira's scarred hand hesitated. You could be targeted, she said. Humans pay dear for this kind of interest. Humans also pay dear for cowardice, he countered, and sometimes they pay less for courage. There was a pause, a small cleft where 2 different kinds of bravery met. Mira turned to him fully, the moonlight, though faint, catching the silver in her fur. "If you stand with me when the papers are revealed," she said, "you should know what kind of man stands beside me. You should know I will not be softened into someone else's story." "I don't want to soften you," Rowan said. "I want to be someone you trust." And he fumbled, because how does a man explain to a woman who has been shaped by moonless nights that her courage has made his heart an unreliable witness? "I already am, in ways I didn't expect." Her expression shifted, softened, then hardened by memory. "People who expect return usually ask for it," she said. "I offer no promises." He smiled, because it was the only honest thing he could give. "Neither do I. I offer only a record of what I see." Between them, the river moved like time, dark and insistent. The days that followed were a sharpening of edges. Alliances whispered, a beta's loyalty wobbling like a candle in wind. A spy sent by some far alpha who wanted to see Alaric's house of cards intact. Rowan found himself pulled into a world where ink and violence balanced precariously, where the cost of a truth might be a life, a title, or the fragile bloom of something tender that neither human nor lichen had room to nurture easily. When at last the archivists gathered under Alaric's watchful gaze, both sides felt the tremor of consequence. Mira's coalition came with witnesses and witnesses' witness, names of those who had signed and sealed forgettings. Alaric's men arrived with dossiers of their own, threats averted, measures taken in the name of pack security. The valley bristled with potential outcomes. Rowan's notebook felt heavier than usual, as if the act of writing might itself tip scales. When at last the archivists gathered under Alaric's watchful gaze, both sides felt the tremor of consequence. Mira's coalition came with witnesses and witnesses' witness, names of those who had signed and sealed forgettings. Alaric's men arrived with dossiers of their own, threats averted, measures taken in the name of pack security. The valley bristled with potential outcomes. Rowan's notebook felt heavier than usual, as if the act of writing might itself tip scales. On the precipice of the inspection, with both sides waiting for the first scroll to be unrolled, the real test emerged. Who would choose the future, one built on exposure and inclusion, or the comfortable tyranny of secrecy? The valley held its breath. The next move would decide more than custody of a buried past. It would define whether a daughter could compel a pack to reweigh the value of blood and mercy. And somewhere, underneath the staged politeness, hearts shifted toward the possibility of a different order, one where a human chronicler might find himself in the dangerous, intoxicating territory of not merely recording history, but making it. The archives smelled like dry paper and cedar, a vault of decisions kept safe against curious eyes. Alaric stood with the kind of posture that had made him an alpha, back straight as a mast, jaw clenched so the skin nodded over his throat. The entire room arranged around the notion that he was the axis any truth must spin upon. The elders had agreed to witnesses. The threshing ground had been set up like a courtroom, with a line of betas flanking Alaric and Mira's rogues pressed like a living gallery opposite. Scribes unrolled brittle scrolls on a low table, and light pooled over ink like blood in a wound. Rowan felt the air thicken as the first paper was opened. He positioned himself near enough to record, but not so near as to be weaponized by the wolves' suspicion. His fingers trembled slightly, an involuntary mimicry of the stakes. To him, this was language and ledger, the place where stories made claims on the world. To Mira, it was a ledger of pain and erasure. To Alaric, it was armor. The first scroll contained the mundane, taxation notes, a roster of sentries. The second grew colder. It bore the official notation, "Removal sanctioned for liability mitigation." Signed beneath the stamped seal was Alaric Voss, and beside it, a line in a smaller hand, "Joint discretion enacted with Ashen Crossing Council." A murmur rose like a tide. Mira's expression cut into something raw, relief flickering with vindication. But the word joint lodged in Rowan's thoughts like a splinter. If Ashen Crossing had been involved, then the political calculus was deeper than Alaric's personal pride. Treaties had been bent around her absence. "Who signed for Ashen Crossing?" Mira asked softly, the steel in her voice quieter than the roar in her chest. Alaric did not answer right away. He swept his gaze across the room until his eyes found Callan, whose face had gone a peculiar shade. Sickly, not from cold, but from the internal climate of guilt. Callan swallowed, and then, as if compelled by the thing justice demands from weak hands, stepped forward. "I have the dispatches," Callan said. Someone in the inner council signed with a cipher. I carried messages. I was told to burn them." His voice broke on the last word. "I couldn't. I hid one copy. I thought it was safer. For the pack." Silence hammered the space between words. The elders shifted like old wood. Faces that had been sculpted by decades of loyalty showed fissures. Alaric's pupils narrowed. For the first time in the valley, the mask of absolute control fractured to reveal not cruelty, but calculation smeared with something like fear. Alaric's retort was the kind of reproof that had shaped his rule. "Callan, you are a fool to speak of these things in public." "I am no fool for speaking the truth," Callan answered, his voice steadier now, as if avenging honesty had given him a small armor. "The dispatch names Lorien of Ashen Crossing. He demanded certainty, blood without human dilution. It was a condition for alliance after the northern raids. He spoke of human-engendered weakness. He wanted proof that Northwood kept itself pure." At that, a sound rose that was neither entirely a gasp nor a cough. The collective intake of air of a community whose bones had suddenly been asked to stoop before shame. Rowan's pen trembled as he wrote the name Lorien. He had heard whispers of the Ashen Crossing's hardness, of deals made in harsh winters. But to hear the demand articulated as a condition for alliance transformed rumor into naked policy. The ledger had turned into a ledger of choice, and that choice had been made in fear. Mira's hands balled into fists. She felt something in her ribs, an ache she had carried for years, break like an old seam. "You handed me away to satisfy a treaty," she said, voice barely more than a breath that cut the room. "You bartered your child." Alaric's face closed over like a book sliding shut. "We protected the pack," he said, each syllable an attempt to make steel from bone. "We prevented a war. Do you want us to risk everything for sentiment, for a reckless love that would sink us all? Is a daughter's life a price worth payment?" Mira spit. "You weigh lives and decide who is alive enough to belong." Around them, the elders murmured. The old arguments for stability versus the new hunger for moral courage. Some betas shifted closer to Alaric, drawing allegiance like a cloak. Others tightened their lips in ways that made their faces strangers. Rowan watched Alaric's inner circle. Faces that had been made by necessity were showing cracks. He knew now the ledger would mean more than a change of policy. It would upend loyalties. Then Mira called for the scroll that had been rumored but never seen. The adoption decree. The notation of her removal. When the parchment was spread, the annotations beneath Alaric's seal bore the explicit phrase, "Ensure removal. Child to be transferred to rogues outside territory. Confidential." Below it, in an accession line, was the script of a name Rowan recognized as not a wolf's. E. Hale. The name landed like a stone thrown through brittle glass. Rowan looked up sharply. His heart reversed in his chest. Hale, his name, inked on a paper that described the handing away of a child. He had always known his surname was not rare in the region, But the coupling of one he bore with the official language of her exile made the room tilt. He had been a chronicler, not a conspirator, yet the ledger had folded his family name into the story. "Rowan?" Mira asked, but her voice did not reach him through the sudden fog of everything that had become personal. Rowan felt 100 possible explanations chase one another. An ancestor who had once served Alaric? A clerk whose hand had copied names? A forgery? He found his voice thin. My family has been in the valley a long time," he said. "But Silence," Alaric snapped, and in that one command the room quailed. The Alpha had the power to convert confusion into chastisement. He used it like a blade. But the hint of a name planted a seed. If a human name was associated with her removal, then the notion of her half-human blood, something Mira had feared but not penned, leaned forward with dangerous possibility. It was a rumor with legs now, and legs that made the old treaty feel malignant. "You used human prejudice as leverage," Mira said softly, addressing the entire assembly now. "You told Ashen Crossing that my blood was not pack blood. You lied." Alaric's answer was a choke of fury and a line of tired explanation. "We negotiated truth with what we had. Lorien wanted security. We gave him certainty. It was—" He stopped, as if the word mercy had left a taste he couldn't swallow. It was the lesser evil. Lesser evil. The phrase landed like a verdict. Many of the elders flinched, not from the truth, but from the language. An older beta with faded scars at his hands joints stood suddenly. He was not a man given to theatrics. He was a man whose face painted the cost of winters past. "And when did a lesser evil become your right?" the elder demanded. "When did you become judge and executioner over the young?" Arguments unfurled like torn banners. Alaric's defenders whispered of geopolitics and the weight of treaties. Mira's witnesses, rogues whose lives had been carved from marginal places, spoke of a child stolen by political fear. Rowan wrote every word, but the page blurred. The truth had been found, and it was uglier than the story he'd imagined. It was not a single cruel decision. It was a governmental choice cloaked in the language of necessity. Within Mira's own coalition, fractures appeared like hairline cracks in ice. A rogue named Kas, once her second who had stood with her in the coldest of raids, stepped back, his jaw a hard line. He had joined her because survival had been his only doctrine, but when he heard Alaric speak of the greater good, something old and pragmatic in him stirred. His life had been a series of compromises that had kept him alive. The knowledge of a treated purity invoked a better-off future he couldn't easily refuse. "You ask me to hate the man who gave me shelter," Kas murmured to Mira later, away from the hearing's burn, his voice not unkind but practical. "I do not think he meant your hurt. He meant to keep us safe. Maybe safety sometimes asks for harsh things." Mira's face, when he spoke, was an unreadable map. Betrayal held many faces. Kas was not the brutal one, but the small, complacent kind that leaves rot in its path. "You chose safety over truth," she said. "I chose truth. You can accept me, or you can choose the shelter of lies." Kas' shoulders tightened. "I choose survival," he said simply, and with that admission, the cords that had once tied them frayed. Rowan watched the split and felt it in his chest like a cold hand. Love, he realized, was not only between romantic partners. It lived in the fragile tissue that bound followers to a leader. Mira had not only forced an alpha to account, she had forced loyalty to ask itself what it was made of. The rogues who had once looked at her with awe now turned and measured their own futures. Back in the threshing ground, Alaric seized on the moment of division. "You will not be fooled by those who would call order cruelty," he said, preying on fear like a predator scents blood. "Trade collapses, borders fail. We cannot allow sentiment to unravel the compacts that keep us alive. The room became a battlefield of rhetoric. Elders who had once deferred to Alaric for the sake of continuity now found themselves weighing the calculus of a future where old bargains were traded for a moral reckoning. A few of Alaric's closest betas, those who had stood with unwavering loyalty, began to show fissures. One older beta, who had been with Alaric since his rise, placed a hand on the alpha's shoulder. It was a gesture that could have been support, but it read to those present like a last attempt to anchor a sinking ship. Rowan's own fracture came in the form of a choice he had to make with dizziness as accompaniment: whether to publicize the ledger that contained his name. He understood, more painfully than he wanted, that the revelation would not just expose Alaric's politics. It could link him, Rowan, to the story in a way that might compromise his objectivity and damn him in both human and Lycan eyes. He felt Mira's gaze on him across the room, a look that asked him to be more than a recorder. It asked him to choose a side. Before he could answer, the hearing exploded into chaos. One of Alaric's betas, older and with a scar that cut across his cheek, rose and slammed the scroll down. "We will not be used," he growled. "If secrets break, then so do treaties. You would start a war." "Then you should have thought of the child," Mira said, her voice a blade. "You should have thought of the person who was erased." Words became fists, a shove, then a howl. The threshing ground slid into the old order of violence with the speed of weather changing. No one intended it, but everyone knew how to move. Rowan pushed, caught a falling scribe, felt the edge of a steel bar pass near his shoulder. The world telescoped into a focus of necessity. Get the document safe, get Mira to a place of advantage, keep the narrative from being stomped underfoot. In the rush, a stray blow meant for weightier things struck someone else. Koss, Mira's once second, was the first to fall. Not from a wound, but from the weight of his decision to step away. He took a blade meant for another and collapsed with the kind of small, bitter irony that kills trust. He was wounded defending a man whose political choices he had just admitted to preferring. Mira fell to her knees at his side, fury and grief in equal measure. "Koss," she whispered, and the sound was a prayer and an accusation at once. Rowan knelt with her, hands inked and trembling, feeling the world pivot. Alliances snapped like thin wood. Secrets that had been kept to secure borders had metastasized into a moral contagion. The result was not the clean victory of truth, but a messy fracture that left everyone bleeding. When the dust settled, the elders declared a temporary recess, official footsteps, official measures, but the damage had been done. The archive had given up its papers, but in doing so, it had opened a wound that would not knit with platitudes. Loyalties had parted like curtains, revealing new, uncertain rooms. Mira rose from Koss's side with eyes that were newly sharpened. Betrayal had come in many forms tonight. The alpha who had bartered her away, the beta who had been cowed, the rogue who had chosen survival over solidarity. And Rowan had stood beside her and yet carried his own secret to weigh into the ledger. In him, she had looked for something steady. Now she felt the tremor of choices yet to be made. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, to no one and to everyone. "Tomorrow we see who stays and who chooses fear." The night closed over the valley like a verdict. Secrets had been dragged into moonlight and fractures left in their wake. Not neat, not resolved, but honest in their danger. In the hush that followed, Rowan found Mira at the edge of the crowd, staring at the road that led away from Northwood. He reached for her, and she did not step back. But when he opened his mouth, the words he had rehearsed, offers of solidarity, confessions of something that had quietly grown, sank into the space between them, where truth and betrayal had gone to war. "I will stay," he said at last, the sentence a small, stubborn thing. "If you still want me." Mira's look was 1,000 winters. I want someone who chooses me even when it costs them, she said. Not a chronicler who finds heroism in ink. Rowan's hands dropped. He had imagined proving himself with documents, with the unassailable weight of proof. He had not accounted for the cost his choice would impose on both their worlds. Around them, pacts murmured, alliances recalculated, and a man who had once abandoned a child prepared to defend what remained of his rule. The fractures had been opened. The next moves would cut deeper. The night closed over the valley like a verdict. Secrets had been dragged into moonlight and fractures left in their wake. Not neat, not resolved, but honest in their danger. In the hush that followed, Rowan found Mira at the edge of the crowd, staring at the road that led away from Northwood. He reached for her, and she did not step back. But when he opened his mouth, the words he had rehearsed, offers of solidarity, confessions of something that had quietly grown, sank into the space between them, where truth and betrayal had gone to war. "I will stay," he said at last, the sentence a small, stubborn thing. "If you still want me." Mira's look was 1,000 winters. "I want someone who chooses me even when it costs them," she said, "not a chronicler who finds heroism in ink." Rowan's hands dropped. He had imagined proving himself with documents, with the unassailable weight of proof. He had not accounted for the cost his choice would impose on both their worlds. Around them, pacts murmured, alliances recalculated, and a man who had once abandoned a child prepared to defend what remained of his rule. The fractures had been opened. The next moves would cut deeper. The choice was no longer merely political. It had become profoundly, destructively personal. And in that terrible intimacy, the question that had driven the night pulsed with new urgency. Would love prove the bridge or the thing that broke them apart? The first blow came not as a roar, but as a single, deliberate command. Alaric's hand slicing the air, a gesture that authorized violence with the economy of a man who had ordered hunts by nod. His loyal betas surged, not all at once, but like wolves answering a hidden whistle, and the threshing ground became a ring of motion. Metal sang, fur flared. Rowan's recorder clattered into a puddle, and he realized he had only one clear thought: keep Mira safe. He moved without thinking. Inside him, the part that had learned to put others into narrative now shoved itself forward into body. He stepped between Mira and the first wolf that lunged, arms raised in the ridiculous human way of someone who thinks pain can be bartered for time. A blade found his shoulder, and the world narrowed to a hot, blossoming star. He tasted iron and winter, and then the steady, mortifying knowledge that his body would betray him if he did not choose. Mira's cry was something old and terrible, more wolf than woman, and the rogues answered in a sound like cracking ice. She pushed through the press with a speed that belied her scars, and where she moved the air seemed to sing, as if the silver in her bones cut through the chaos. For a second she was a force of nature, an avalanche of grief and wrath that had been waiting for permission to fall. Rowan sagged back against the press of bodies, clutching his wound. Blood feathered over his coat. He had not expected to bleed for her. He'd expected to write about her and perhaps fall into an ache that would be documented in careful paragraphs. He had not mapped the way love could make a man reckless. "Mira!" he gasped. He hated that his voice came out raw. It sounded like a plea. She was at his side in one motion, hands like anvils pressing into his wound, eyes huge, luminous, with the figuring of fury and fear braided together. "Rowan," she breathed, the name an exhale and a command. She had knives in her shoulders and light in her bones, but her hands were suddenly only human, tender, fierce, real. For a moment, the fight fractured. Anything that looks like love in the middle of a skirmish is disorienting to those whose economy runs on power. Betas hesitated. Elders blinked. Alaric, standing like an immovable shore, watched his world tilt, and, for an absurd, vulnerable moment, Rowan saw the old man unclench. The blade in his hand lowered a fraction. "You bloody fool," Alaric said. Not a condemnation of Rowan alone, but the raw sound of a father startled by the consequences of his own architecture. "You would use a human as a shield?" Rowan laughed, a thin sound that tasted of iron and snow. "I would use myself," he said. "I will be the thing you cannot burn, if it buys time for the rest of them." Mira's head turned toward Alaric then, and for once the long list of pain between them was not raw with accusation, but with a single, insistent demand. "Stop. This ends," she said, voice threaded with the precise cold that had unpicked contracts. "You chose to make me disappear. You chose to make me less. You will not choose to make more of us vanish tonight." Alaric's face shifted. He had built his reign on calculus and cruelty wrapped as care. Now the calculus had a beating heart in the middle of it. He looked at Rowan, at the human planted between a daughter he had exiled and the men who had been his instruments. And something like recognition, or perhaps shame, erased his practiced composure. "You think sacrificing one man will buy you absolution?" he asked, words brittle. Rowan coughed blood and smiled, absurd and small. "No," he said, "but sometimes sacrifice wakes those who slept on rules." Alaric's defenses, decades of armor forged from treaty and terror, were undermined by a simple, human act. He glanced at Callan, at the elder who had placed a hesitant hand on his shoulder earlier, at the betas who had watched their own consciences begin to twitch. The wolf who had once only calculated now found himself measured against a daughter's courage and a human's willingness to die for a truth. The decision that followed was not sudden like a cut. It was slow and catastrophic and beautifully human. Alaric lowered his weapon. He called for ceasefire with a voice that sounded like a man calling a halt to a storm he had fed for years. "Enough," he said. "Enough." Silence rode the word like a crest of white. Mira's knees buckled where she had been supporting Rowan. He let herself fall into her arms, the pain ricocheting into a different register. Fear braided with the peculiar warmth of being kept. She pressed her forehead to his, the world narrowing to the space where their breaths met. "Stay with me," she said, the command a prayer. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered, "not after what I saw tonight." Alaric watched. The visible cracks in him were more than political. They were human. He had almost lost a daughter to diplomacy and a chronicler to principle. The realization hammered something open in him that had been sealed by years of fear. He had been wrong in the name of safety. He stepped forward, not toward Mira, but toward the assembly, with the gravity of a man who understands the currency of confession. "I made a choice," he said, voice rawer than anyone had heard it. "I made you a casualty of what I called stability. For that there is no neat apology. I will not ask for forgiveness. I will offer restitution." Murmurs cascaded like thaw. Restitution in a Pax language often equals the transfer of lands, of favors, of positions. Alaric's face was open now, unarmored, and whatever pride he had left now slid into purpose. "I will step down as Alpha," he announced, the air puckering as if a decision of stones had been moved. "I will submit to council and to the terms the pact demands. I will put my role into public account and accept whatever justice is given. I will unseal the treaties and face what was made in darkness." The ground under Rowan's boots felt new. He had heard rulers promise before. He had watched civility cover old cruelties. But something in the way Mira inhaled, like someone who had half expected worse and now tasted an improbable mercy, told him this might be more than words. She rose, the moonless silver in her fur flaring like a banner. She knelt to remove the blade and pressed her hands to Rowan's wound with a concentration that felt like sacrament. "If you still choose this," she said quietly, fierce as winter and as intimate as breath, "then stay, but not for pity. Stay because you want this. Stay because you would live in the world we make." Rowan met her eyes. They were not asking for rescue. They were offering partnership. He exhaled a laugh that sounded like a small, brave thing. "I choose you," he said simply, and the words landed like vows that had no legal power, but all the kind that softened armor. "And if that costs me everything here, then I will pay it gladly." She smiled then, a breaking, glorious thing, a sun through cloud. Around them, the pack shifted, as if the future had become a conversation instead of a decree. Alaric, raw with the first truth he'd admitted in years, bowed his head, in a motion that was apology and surrender both. Kos, wounded and breathing, looked up and found Mira's gaze. He nodded, a ragged sign that some loyalties could be reclaimed. Callan wept, quiet, hard tears that were not a spectacle but a private repentance. In that moment, between the ache of Rowan's wound and the fragile promise of Alaric's abdication, Mira made a choice that was neither vengeance nor blind mercy. She stepped forward and placed a hand on Alaric's shoulder, not in supplication, but in claim. "We will rebuild," she said, voice carrying steady. "Not on control, not on fear, on truth." Alaric flinched at the touch, father and opponent in one, but did not pull away. It was as if she had offered him a chance to be more than the man he had been. Rowan, bleeding and warm against the snow, let himself believe. He had chosen a dangerous tenderness. And when Mira leaned in and pressed her lips to his, it was not an end, but a promise made in the middle of ruin. That love could be a radical governance. That mercy could be the architecture of a new pack. He tasted snow and iron and the salt of a future that would be earned, not granted. Around them, the valley exhaled. Warriors put weapons down, not because they had been ordered, but because the human heart had altered the shape of command. The night did not resolve into easy peace. There were consequences, reparations to be made, and lives to reweigh. But for the first time in years, the future seemed like a place they might walk into together. Mira held Rowan as betas began to speak of councils, as elders prepared lists of restitution, as rogues tended wounds and counted the cost of loyalty. The cost had been paid in blood and in courage. The redemption came with the hard work of making a pack fit for the truth. Rowan's sacrifice, small and mortal, had been a hinge. It had not bought absolution, but had opened a door. He had given the night a human proof that sometimes to change a world you must be willing to stand where the blades fall and let love rewrite the ledger. They rebuilt not with proclamations, but with small, stubborn acts that smelled of smoke and bread and honest labor. Councils met at dawn and again at night, not to ratify more secrets, but to argue, to confess, to make lists and promises that would be kept. Elders who had once recited Alaric's decrees now read aloud statements of restitution, land to be shared, hunters' rights revised, a new charter that named humans and rogues and omegas as beings with voices, not liabilities. The word,